All right, Dr. Glenn Deason, thank you very much for staying with us. We are still waiting for both Presidents Trump and Zelensky to emerge from those closed doors at Mar-a-Lago. But this conversation between Trump and Putin, the key points from Ushakov's statements: the Russian president agreed with Trump's proposal to continue work on a settlement within the framework of specially created working groups. The parameters of the working groups on Ukraine will be announced in early January. The American leader stated the need to end the war as quickly as possible, and then he raised the issue of Donbass, saying that he will raise the issue with Ukraine, and Ukraine has to cede Donbass as soon as possible for peace to prevail. What do you make of it?
Well, the Donbass is very difficult for the Russians to negotiate on. So I think so far where the Russians are flexible, I think, is to create new administrative line for what is Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. In other words, they might be willing to freeze where the front is now and then let this be the new borders. Again, they haven't confirmed this, but this is a possibility. Donbass, however, given that this was the scene of the conflict for 11 years now, they won't negotiate anything there. So they already have Lugansk. The other part of Donbass is Donetsk. They're missing three major cities, which is Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Konstantinivka. Now, these are good fortification lines for the Ukrainians. So if you think that the Russians will just stop temporarily and then move on, then of course there would be apprehensions in Kyiv to give up this territory, because then they would lose the best defensive line, and then they wouldn't really have much anymore thereafter until the Russians would reach the Dnieper River. So the concerns from the Ukrainian side are quite reasonable in terms of doubting that the Russians are sincere. But from the Russian perspective, this is this is simply non-negotiable, and this is why the territorial issue has now been a massive problem. If we would have gone back to beginning of 2022, when the Russians and the Ukrainians were negotiating in Istanbul, none of this would have been a problem. None of these territories would have been claimed. So it would have been much easier. But again, this is what 4 years of war has done. And also part of the reasons why the Russians demand Donbass is because they fear on the other side that the Europeans and the future American administration will encourage the Ukrainians again to challenge Russia. Mm-hmm. So for this reason, they want to hold these same strategic territories, which are good for defense. And I think all of this reflects the wider problem of this war, because this really goes back 30 years of post-Cold War history of creating a Europe without Russia. And this is what the Russians have been saying since the 90s. That is, you can't simply expand NATO up their borders, and they always made it clear that Ukraine was their ultimate red line. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of the consequence now of 30 years of ignoring Russian security concerns, and now, of course, Russia has said they will just take care of their security through military force, and it's a real impasse, and both sides are willing to escalate to a great extent, which we've already seen, which makes this so very much more dangerous. But of course, the whole problem here is a solution, because when the Russians say we want to address the root causes, this is what they're saying. This is what they're talking about. 30 years of what they see as flawed policies or aggressive policies by NATO. It's very difficult to reverse this.
Dr. Deason, sorry to cut you short, but there's something that I read that caught my eye, and it's a different kind of wording that has been put between the call between Trump and Putin. A responsible decision from Kyiv is required for the final cessation of hostilities. This was never there before. I think there's a different kind of wording that has been put in place, don't you think?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that phrase.
A responsible decision from Kyiv is required for the final cessation of hostilities. A responsible decision from Kyiv is required for the final cessation of hostilities?
Yeah, that would be for Kyiv to essentially accept the Russian terms, I think. But again, this is why the whole talks now between Trump and Zelensky are so strange, because all the things that Zelensky and the Europeans demand completely contradict what the Russians demand. So, for example, the Europeans say that well, they will continue no matter what to support Ukraine to uphold its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Well, when they say sovereignty, they mean Ukraine's right to join any military bloc they want. In other words, for European troops to be allowed to enter Ukraine. And when they talk about territorial integrity, of course, that means that they shouldn't be allowed to cede any territories. Mm-hmm. So none of this, it directly contradicts what essentially the Americans and the Russians have already agreed upon, more or less, are the root causes of the conflict. Mm-hmm. Something
also very interesting is that Trump spoke business. He said that he has impressive prospects for economic cooperation between the US and Russia if the conflict in Ukraine ends. So that specifically means sanctions is out of the question.
Yeah, that would be one of the incentives that the US can use to sway the Russians. I don't think the sanctions are the main thing the Russians are going for. They would like to have some reassurances on the security architecture of Europe, because whatever Trump promises today, that NATO won't expand anymore, all of this is what Russians have been asking for the past 30 years. However, Trump will be gone in 3 years' time, at least so we assume. And most likely, if the Democrats take power, they will reverse everything and probably go back to something looking more like Biden's foreign policy. So if this is the case, then all the agreements they're doing now isn't worth that much. That being said, they would like, of course, the sanctions to be removed, and very importantly, they want all their money back, because the EU has more or less permanently frozen these Russian assets. They've also taken quite a bit out of the proceeds. So they want a reversal on all of this, of course. But again, the main issue is, what do we do about the European security architecture? Right. Because the whole premise for the past 30 years is, how do you build European security? Well, that was to simply expand NATO and EU further and further east, and essentially cut off Russia from any representation or any seat at the table in Europe. So we ended up with this bizarre situation where every country in Europe should be a part of these main institutions, that is NATO and the EU, except for Russia, which happens to be the country with the largest population, the largest territory, the largest economy, and the largest military. And so what we call now European integration is actually a bit of a zero-sum project, where we ask neighboring countries, be it Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, you have to choose between us or the Russians. Right. And a lot of this instigates internal conflicts, including now civil war, and also incentivizes foreign powers, that is both NATO and Russia, to intervene directly into this and essentially try to bet on their side. So we walk down a very dangerous path. Much of this was recognized by the Europeans already back in the 2000s, but nothing was ever done. So it's very difficult to see how we can address all of these issues now and have all of it resolved.
Exactly.
Because Trump seems to want a quick fix, but there is no quick fix to this.